Okay, now we're going to talk about the implementation of a for loop when we evaluate which of these radio buttons have been clicked by the user. So this is what we're going to end up with. So we're going to click on the first radio button here and click on Submit, and we get a response, an alert box saying you selected button number 1. If we click on the second button, Submit, you selected button number 2, and the third, of course, will return button number 3. In your HTML, all 3 of these radio buttons have to be grouped by name, and we have to go through each member of the group in JavaScript, and to do that we use the for loop. Okay, so to show you this, what we'll do is we'll take the script for this and we'll take a look at it in Notepad here. And the first thing I want to do is go over the HTML for this. And the HTML basically forces us to use the name attribute. And we have to make sure that all 3 of the buttons, less than 10 years old, the 10 to 30 years old, and over the hill, each one of those radio buttons has to have the same name in that declaration. Now, without that, you're not going to get the exclusive property of the radio button, which means that when we click on a radio button, it's going to unclick whichever one happens to be clicked. Also here, just as a side note, by default, I use the attribute checked to automatically check the less than 10 years old button. I just did that because it was at the top. Now, let's go up to the top of the HTML here, and you'll notice that inside the JavaScript I have a function called checkRadio. Okay, it's a function I made up, and it is composed of a for loop. And the for loop begins exactly the same way as the previous for loop did, except that we begin with the number 0 instead of the number 1. And the reason for that is that we have in a series of radio buttons an array or a list of buttons, all of which have the name age. And we have to go through those buttons one at a time. Now, JavaScript counts to a large extent beginning with the number 0 rather than the number 1. That sounds sort of counterintuitive, but it's the way that that happens in many programming languages. Not all, certainly, but some of the more advanced programming languages begin with 0 as the first element in an array, or in the first element of, let's say, a list of values. And so after I is assigned to 0, we check to see, and this is the conditional statement here, we check to see if the value of I is less than the number of radio buttons in the form. That's what document.myform.age.length means. This is the length refers to the number of radio buttons which have been given the name age in my form or form my form in the HTML document here. So again, my form, using the capital F here, must match the capital F down here, etc. Age has got to be exactly the same case as here. Length returns the value of the number of radio buttons to that series of radio buttons. And again, we see the I++ incrementation here. That, of course, returns the value of I+1 every time that this gets hit at the end of the final brace of the for loop, which is actually here. So let's go through this and see how it works. We have I equals 0. I is going to stand for then the first radio button in that area. If document myform.age and then bracket I, which means basically now that I is 0, this is age, bracket 0, dot checked equals true, then we're going to say alert, you selected button number, and then it will give us the value of the button or the number of the button that we've clicked, sort of in the English translation, which means it's either going to be 1, 2, or 3, not 0, 1, and 2. So if document.myform.age sub 0.checked, checked being the checked property of the button, is true, then we're going to say use selected button number I plus 1. If it is not true, if it's false, of course we dump out of the if statement and we go to the final brace after the for statement, and then we repeat this loop until, in fact, we hit the checked button. And because by default we used the checked attribute for one of those buttons, there's no way that we're going to have the user go through this form and leave one of those radio buttons unchecked. So here's an example, again, of using a for loop, of checking multiple radio buttons to see which one of the however many there are checked. And the beauty here is that we could even add radio buttons later on, and it would still go through and automatically do the math, even though we have altered the number of radio buttons there. And we can actually do that right here in the code. I'm going to change this code slightly, and we'll put down another line of HTML here. I'm just going to copy that and paste it right below. Okay, I'm going to leave the same name here, and then just say too old to care anymore. All right, so we've now added a fourth radio button. Okay, I'm going to save this as JS17A. All right, I'll minimize that, and then I'll bring 17A in over here. And I now can click on any one of these four buttons. I'm just going to click on the fourth here, click on Submit. And it's sure enough, the code that I wrote was flexible and allowed me to enter in that next button without me having to go back and rewrite my JavaScript. All I had to do is modify my raw HTML, and the JavaScript automatically accommodated that addition. That is one of the ways that you can efficiently and should efficiently write JavaScript code.